Hey guys, tonight we travel through the scorched winds and sun-baked soil of West Africa, across the rolling Sahel where the desert sighs and the savanna breathes. The air here feels ancient. The sand clings to your eyelashes. Dust swirls like incense around sunken stone foundations, all that's left of once mighty courts. You hear it faintly drums in the distance, maybe thunder. But you'll soon learn it was a queen's procession long vanished her footsteps, erased by centuries of storms. Tonight we're chasing the forgotten female rulers of the Sahel kingdoms. Yes, queens, real ones, not just the ceremonial kind. Women who ruled trade empires, led cavalry charges, negotiated desert alliances, and carved their names sometimes literally into stone. Most of them don't show up in your history textbooks. Some were deliberately erased. Others were simply lost to time like footprints in a sandstorm. And yet their influence lingers like smoke, visible only when the light hits just right. You probably won't survive this heat, by the way. It's 112 degrees in the shade if you can find any. The wind tastes like copper, and the buzzards look hopeful. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake, after the intro, let me know your local time and where you're listening from. It's always fun to see who's drifting off with me around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into the first scene, a faded ruin on the edge of the Niger River. Scraggly reeds whisper at your ankles. The earth is cracked and hot underfoot. You duck under a low stone arch, the only piece left of a structure that might have been a palace, or a tomb, or a sacred court. You imagine a queen standing where you are now, shaded by a leather parasol, issuing commands in a language no longer spoken. This region called the Sahel is a long stretch of land between the Sahara Desert to the north and the lush savanna to the south. It's the in-between place, both literally and culturally. And that's what made it powerful. Whoever controlled this line, this sandy spine, controlled the movement of goods, people, and influence between the great Islamic empires of North Africa and the forest kingdoms below. And sometimes the people in control were women, not token figureheads, not royal wives with decorative titles, queens in their own right, rulers with command over armies, judges in disputes, owners of land and herds and humans. The record is patchy, sure. Written accounts from Arab chroniclers often left out their names or buried them in vague phrases like his mother or the queen of that place. But oral traditions, griot songs, and the subtle clues in archaeological sites tell a more vivid story. Take, for example, a local tale from around the ancient city of Kukia. It speaks of a woman who wore silver on her brows and commanded men with a glance. She held council at dawn beneath a baobab tree and could speak the sun into softening. Her people said she never lost an argument or a battle, her name completely forgotten, but the tale remains passed quietly from grandmothers to granddaughters during evening meals. Historians still argue whether she ruled during the Gao Empire's early consolidation or was a figure of folklore layered over a real consort's life. But the consistency of the stories suggests someone real stood behind the myth. Maybe several someones. Here's the quirky part. In many Sahelian societies, power wasn't always passed down through the father. Some clans trace descent through the mother, giving women more influence in inheritance, land rights, and royal succession. You could be queen, not because your husband was king, but because your uncle was. Family trees bent sideways in the Sahel, and in those branches, female rule found a foothold. And if you're imagining these women as serene figures lounging in silk, well, think again. In the oral traditions of Takrur, a kingdom nestled in the Senegal River Valley, there's the story of a queen who kept a pet lion. Not metaphorically, literally. She rode into battle with it chained beside her horse. And supposedly she once ordered a peace envoy to bring live fish in a desert drought to prove they could keep her people fed. Bold move. Probably not great for the fish. The Sahel was no monolith. It held dozens of small kingdoms, and shifting alliances and the influence of Islam only deepened the cultural complexity. As Islam spread southward along trade routes, many female rulers adapted. They sponsored Quranic schools, wore modest robes over traditional jewelry, and issued rulings rooted in both Sharia and ancestral customs. Others resisted, fiercely clinging to matrilineal norms and female-led councils. Of course, this mix didn't always go smoothly. There are tales of imams refusing to pray in royal courts led by women, of queens quietly funding mosques but barring male scholars from dictating their rule. These tensions left shadows gaps in historical records where a ruler's gender becomes ambiguous. But you're here now, and if you close your eyes, you can almost see her, a queen walking barefoot at dusk, her anklets jingling softly, a scroll tucked under her arm. She stops, turns, and smiles. She knows you've come looking. You walk on. The dust settles a little. The sun hasn't let up, but now there's a breeze carrying the scent of dried millet and smoke. In the near distance, goats bleat, and the rhythmic thud of a mortar and pestle echoes from somewhere within a courtyard. You're entering what used to be called the drought line, the border where dry desert land meets the green belt, and kingdoms of the Sahel used to rise and fall like waves, constantly adjusting to the changing environment. This is where the queens of the drought line once ruled. The Sahel was never an easy place to govern. Rainfall was unpredictable, and every decision when to plant, when to migrate, when to trade could mean life or starvation. You imagine being queen here wasn't about luxury. It was about logistics. You had to know where the wells were sweetest, which tribe had the fastest camel messengers, and who was about to switch allegiance. You needed wisdom, sure, but also maps, grain reserves, and a memory sharp enough to recall which cousin betrayed which aunt last season. In regions like Silla Takrur and the early Songhai territories, female leadership often emerged not as anomaly, but as strategy. In part, that was thanks to the nature of Sahelian society. Many groups were clan-based with lineages that revered senior women as custodians of the group's spiritual and economic integrity. If your grandmother held the clan amulet, your grandmother made the rules. Period. A mainstream historical fact you might find surprising: in some Sahel kingdoms, royal women weren't just advisors. They held titles like Tonkara or Linguere that indicated their official position in governance. These titles weren't symbolic. A linguere might control tax collection, oversee land disputes, or organize cross-border trade deals. In some cases, they even led diplomatic missions themselves, flanked by caravan guards and carrying letters stamped in wax and palm oil. Now, the quirky tidbit of the Night One oral tradition from the Yolof Empire speaks of a queen who refused to sit on anything but a leopard skin mat. Not out of vanity, but because she believed the spirits of her ancestors would whisper more clearly through it. Reportedly, she once threw a visiting Portuguese merchant out of court because he offered her silk instead of something with teeth. Tough crowd. You pass a cracked well. The air changes, the sharp scent of iron-rich water mingles with dry earth. You picture a queen standing here in the early morning, lifting a leather bucket, listening to her advisors drone on about tribute routes and cattle thefts. She isn't distracted. She's already calculated the next 3 moves in her head. Historians still argue whether the power these women held was formalized or informal, whether they were recognized as sovereigns in the same way as their male counterparts, or whether their authority was more subtly executed through kinship networks, religious influence, and economic control. The truth is probably both. Sahelian queens, like most powerful women in history, knew how to work with what they had. They didn't always sit on thrones. Sometimes they stood behind them and whispered. In the dusty records of Arab travelers, men like al-Bakri or Ibn Battuta, you sometimes find curious references. A certain chief woman in a court, a governess holding authority while the king is away. These glimpses are tantalizing but vague. The chroniclers, often coming from strongly patriarchal contexts, may not have recognized or accepted the concept of a female sovereign, so they minimized, or mistranslated, or just skipped it entirely. And yet the griots remembered. You come to a worn field where tufts of millet once grew thick. The soil is soft. You kneel down and scoop a handful. It smells like ash and sun. You imagine a queen sending word from here to a rival camp, a small clay tablet, inscribed with symbols only a few could read. Her message, "Stay off my riverbank." Or perhaps more diplomatically, "Let's meet under the baobab at dusk." Even now, women across the Sahel carry echoes of that heritage. In local markets, it's often the elderly women who control prices. In rural households, grandmothers settle disputes not with shouting but with a glance. These aren't modern phenomena. They're survival tactics passed down from centuries of matrilineal wisdom. You can feel it, the weight of history behind their calm. And then, in the distance, drums. Not a recording, not from a Bluetooth speaker, though honestly you'd believe anything out here. These are ancient. You can hear the polyrhythms, the fast tapping of a lead drummer, interlaced with the low thump of a bass. Someone is playing for the rain or the harvest, or maybe just to remember. The sound gets into your bones. You feel the music before you understand it. A cool wind picks up. Somewhere ahead, another story is waiting, one with gold camels and a queen who didn't just rule from behind closed doors. She ran the whole road. You're walking again. The terrain is shifting under your feet, hard-packed sand giving way to beaten paths that once bore the weight of caravan trains. The air is heavy with memory. Ahead, the sun glints off something buried in the dust. You crouch and brush it clean, a worn piece of brass, possibly a coin, or maybe a decorative weight once used to measure gold dust. Either way, it's a clue. You're now walking the trade routes, roads made not of stone but of trust, tribute, and the slow, deliberate hoof prints of camels carrying fortunes. And some of those fortunes were managed by queens. This was the Gold Road, a glittering artery that ran from the mines of Bambouk and Bure to the cities of the north. Before Europe really figured out how to mine its own gold, effectively it looked south here. The Sahel wasn't just a dry belt of land. It was a vault, and someone had to run the vault. Enter the matriarchs of the market towns. Mainstream history tends to skip over this part, but women were central players in the gold trade, not just as miners, wives, or weavers of basketry for carrying ore, but as owners of trade permits, caravan investors, and tax collectors. In ancient Ghana and Mali records show female figures acting as agents in the weighing and taxing of gold dust. And this wasn't some side hustle. These women often accumulated serious political clout from their wealth. One traveler from Al-Andalus noted somewhat stiffly that he had to negotiate with a woman of commerce who refused to lower her price even for a diplomatic envoy. The implication: she had final say. You can imagine the scene, him sweating through his robe, her sipping fermented millet beer, and not budging an inch. Now for a quirky little gem, one Sahelian tale describes a woman who danced on scales. Literally. Before any major trade deal, she would step barefoot onto the merchant's weighing platform to demonstrate that she trusted her own tools. And the legend goes, if she ever found the scales rigged, she'd curse the trader's goods for 7 dry seasons. I mean, sure, it's probably not peer-reviewed science, but still, you'd want to check your calibration. These matriarchs were especially dominant in cities like Kumbi-Saleh Djenne and later Timbuktu. These weren't backwater towns. Djenne, for instance, boasted one of the oldest known mosques in sub-Saharan Africa and was a literacy hub centuries before the printing press hit Europe. Women didn't just participate, they anchored the market economy. Queens, even if not named in official coronation lists, often exercised control by owning river ports, levying tolls, and ensuring their own kin were placed in the merchant guilds. Historians still debate whether these queens inherited their economic influence or built it from the ground up through market dominance and marriage alliances. But there's growing consensus that their power was systemic, not just the result of charismatic personalities, but a feature of how Sahelian society worked. When markets are mobile and literacy is low power, goes to whoever can remember the rules and enforce them with a smile. You step into the shade of what once might have been a warehouse. A few bricks remain red clay fused with fragments of charcoal. You imagine baskets stacked high with salt blocks from Tahaza ivory, from the forest kingdoms, and golden cloth, dyed with tamarind and ash. And at the center, a queen's seal on a scroll, perhaps no bigger than your palm, marking who owed what to whom. You hear voices. Not actual voices, don't worry, you haven't completely lost it. But the faint echoes of bargaining of stories told between sales of news passed with handfuls of cola nuts. The Sahel was never silent. It buzzed with deals, gossip, and prayers, sometimes all three in the same breath. And now you can almost see her, a queen not with a crown but a ledger, her hair braided high with copper rings, her robes dark with indigo. She moves through the market without needing to shout. Everyone already knows what she expects. Her son stands behind her, watching and learning. She waves off a gift from a merchant too generous, too political, and pauses to correct the price of millet cakes at a nearby stall. That's the thing. Power here wasn't always announced. Sometimes it was assumed quietly, unquestionably, a tilt of the head, a raised eyebrow, a ledger closed with finality. And while the camels kept moving north and the coins kept changing hands, her name was passed quietly in griot songs. Maybe you won't find it in a museum, but out here beneath this sky on this old gold road, her memory lingers. One last note before we move on. That gold, a lot of it ended up in European treasuries melted down anonymous. But before it got there, it passed through hands like hers. And for a moment, those hands held the pulse of an entire economy. You brush your palms on your trousers, stand up and look to the horizon. There's more ahead. A queen who made the rain fall is waiting. You step into lower ground now. The terrain softens beneath your feet, springy with river-fed grass. The air changes. Two cooler, moister, tinged with the scent of old reeds and wet bark. Crickets chirp from somewhere hidden, and the frogs are loud tonight. You're moving toward the heartland of Gao, a place that once pulsed with caravans, kings, and calculations. But you're not here for any of them. You're here for a queen who ruled the clouds. She doesn't appear in every textbook, but in these lands her name still echoes Nari Koima, Mother of the Rain. The city of Gao rose beside the Niger River centuries before the famous Songhai Empire took full control. Its early rulers governed with gold diplomacy and, when necessary, a display of spiritual force. Gao wasn't just about territory. It was about survival between extremes. The desert loomed to the north. Tropical forests lurked south. The Sahel was balance only the wise could rule it long. And one queen ruled it during a time when the balance broke. Drought. Not a single season, but several. Wells choked with sand, millet fields cracked like eggshells. Cattle died where they stood, their hides tight over ribs. You see it in your mind as you walk carts, with nothing to carry, women scraping bowls, clean of phantom grains. And amid it all, Nari Koima doesn't hide. She moves openly, speaking with elders, consulting sky watchers, and refusing to send soldiers to neighboring towns for food. Her people call her the one who listens, but they're also waiting for her to act, and she does. She rises before dawn on the 3rd day of the 5th month, walks barefoot through the dust outside Gao's northern gate. No ceremony, no guards. Just her a short staff in one hand and a robe black as night wrapped tight around her body. She stops in the middle of a flat field, lifts her arms, and sings. Not loud, not operatic. Just one long, low chant, repeated over and over like a lullaby meant for the sky. By midday, the clouds begin to gather. By sunset, it rains. Mainstream scholars acknowledge Gao's early complexity, its mosques, markets, and metallurgy. They acknowledge the trade with Egypt, Morocco, and beyond. But they rarely mention its female leaders. Still, oral tradition from the Songhai tells you Nari Koima didn't just pray, she ruled. She allocated rations, she changed crop rotations, she ordered the construction of underground cisterns and flood trenches. She trained a generation of girls in reading seasonal patterns through animal behavior. And when the rains returned, they didn't surprise her. They arrived like a guest she'd invited. You step onto firmer ground now. A stretch of ancient road, still visible beneath low brush. It runs alongside what used to be palace gardens. Evidence from digs here suggests a network of clay-lined irrigation paths once crisscrossed these fields. A grove of acacia trees rises nearby, perfect for shade medicine and, according to legend, ritual tools. One fringe story says Nari Koima's staff was carved from the branch of a lightning-struck acacia and capped with a knot of stone carved into the shape of a frog's back. That detail may not make it into museum plaques, but griots repeat it anyway, especially to children afraid of storms. You reach a shallow bend in the river. The water is calm here, smooth as fabric. A heron lifts from the bank and disappears into the dusk. This spot was sacred, they say. Not just for ritual bathing or water collection, but for listening. Nari Koima returned here weekly, sometimes alone, sometimes with her advisors. They didn't speak. They observed the clouds, the insects, the way leaves shifted in the heat. Her court understood that silence was a skill, not a pause. Most rulers filled the air with commands. She filled it with outcomes. She wore authority like breath, invisible, necessary, constant. You crouch near the bank and run your fingers along a piece of smooth carved stone sticking out from the silt. It could have been part of a platform, maybe a bench, maybe a base for a cauldron or a wash bowl. Either way, someone placed it here with purpose, the kind of purpose that comes from ritual repetition over generations. Historians still argue whether Nari Koima held formal kingship or acted as a spiritual regent during a transitional era. Some claim she was the sister of a local king who died without heirs. Others suggest she took power in a matrilineal succession system rarely seen in later Sahel empires. What's more agreed upon is that her legacy shaped Gao's reputation for decades, even centuries. Later Songhai rulers, including Askia Muhammad, encouraged female participation in education and agricultural planning. That impulse didn't appear out of nowhere. She set a model. She proved that ruling the land wasn't about conquering it, it was about knowing when to ask it nicely. You rise slowly, the frogs have quieted, or maybe you just stop noticing them. The stars above you shimmer, faintly reflected in the water. Behind you, Gao sleeps. Not the modern town that stands today, but the memory of a place where rain was currency and queens were its keepers. You keep walking. The soil under your heels still holds moisture. And in the distance through the reeds, you swear you hear a voice. Not calling, not chanting, just humming. You follow the path along the river's edge. The soil grows firmer again, and the vegetation thins. Dry brush returns, and with it the sense of something watching. Not hostile, just old. You step onto a wide plain, the kind used for cavalry drills or military musters. It's flat enough to see the horizon. You squint, shielding your eyes from the setting sun, and picture the hoofprints now long erased. This is where you meet her, the warrior queen of Takrur. She's not dressed in robes, she wears leather. Her arms are bare, thick with sun and training. Her face is painted in dark stripes, one for every victory. She rides a horse she broke herself. And when she dismounts, it obeys her without reins. She doesn't wait to be addressed. She speaks first. Takrur was a kingdom nestled along the Senegal River. And during its peak in the 11th century, it was a political and military force to be reckoned with. It adopted Islam, early controlled vital trade routes, and managed relations with both desert and forest peoples. But what made Takrur different, what made it feared, was the discipline of its military. And at least once that military was led by a queen. Her name doesn't survive in stone, but she survives in song. According to Pular oral tradition, a woman from the ruling clan of Takrur once took command after her brother died in a border ambush. The council expected her to name a male successor. She named herself instead. The council resisted. She offered a choice bend or ride out with her and prove you could do better. Most rode out. Few came back ahead of her. You stop at a slight rise in the ground. It might have been a hilltop fortress once. A few broken stones lie scattered in the dust. Some are scorched. A battlefield. A campfire site, hard to say. But the feeling of vigilance clings to the air. You can almost smell oil on armor. Here's a mainstream fact. Military women weren't unheard of in Sahelian history. While formal royal titles skewed male battlefield leadership, occasionally passed to daughters, wives, or sisters, when no viable male heir existed or when the women were just better at the job. In Takrur, where lineage could be matrilineal, royal women held enough clout to mobilize troops. One Arab chronicler even noted with shock that a woman of noble rank led many horses across the river without fear. Now your fringe tidbit for tonight, the warrior queen of Takrur supposedly wore a copper bracelet inscribed with a single word, return. It wasn't a command to her enemies. It was a promise to her people. Every time she rode out, she tapped it twice before mounting. She never lost a campaign. She always returned. Historians still debate whether the Queen's military authority was absolute or temporary. Some argue that she ruled during crisis, then stepped aside. Others believe she maintained power through strategic marriages, battlefield loyalty, and elite family alliances. What's more intriguing is how her memory survived. Griots pass her name in riddles. The river swallowed the sun, but she brought it back on a horse. The iron wind had a woman's breath. Her legend outpaced her title. You find a dried hoofprint deep and sharp-edged, still embedded in a patch of hardened mud. Maybe not hers, maybe not even ancient. But you smile anyway. It feels right. The Sahel didn't favor the gentle. Rulers had to act quickly, defend borders, and make examples. But brutality alone didn't win loyalty. Strategy did. The Queen of Takrur organized her cavalry into rotating squads named for birds, eagles for speed owls for night patrols, and vultures for recovery. Each squad had a female lead responsible not just for tactics, but for morale and rituals. Before battle, the Queen's troops sang, not to frighten, to focus. You walk farther onto the plain. A warm breeze stirs the grass. You imagine the sounds, hoofbeats, orders shouted in 3 languages, the thud of leather armor tightened with rope, and in the center of it all, her, quiet, mounted, watching. She didn't shout. She didn't ride at the front. She waited. Let the scouts do their work. Let the enemy make the first mistake. Then she moved. You step past a flattened ring of stones. Old fire pit, maybe, or a training circle. Someone once stood here day after day practicing the same moves until muscle memory replaced thought. She would have known every angle, every vulnerability of a camel-mounted fighter, every blind spot in a sun-blinded ambush. Her soldiers followed her, not because they feared her wrath. They followed her because she made it home every time. And when she died, the griots say her horse refused to be ridden again. It waited by her tomb for 3 days and then walked into the river alone. You stand there watching the last of the sun bleed into the ground. The wind carries the scent of iron leather and something sharper memory. You don't need to see her face. You've seen enough to know she's still riding somewhere, just ahead of the dust. You leave the training grounds behind. The earth rises slightly now, forming a long, shallow ridge. You crest it and look down into a hollow, buzzing with life. The smell hits you first, smoke-dried fish, sweat, and spice. Below you is a market, or what used to be one. All that's left now are the bones-collapsed wooden posts, worn paths between former vendor stalls, scattered shards of pottery half swallowed by the ground. But close your eyes and you can hear it. Bartering, singing, arguing over pepperweights. You step down into the heart of what once pulsed as the economic engine of a Sahelian city. And here you meet her, not a queen with a crown, but with a ledger. One of the mothers of the marketplace. The phrase sounds poetic, but it was a job title. In many Sahelian trading hubs, Kumbi Saleh Jene, later Timbuktu markets, weren't managed by kings or governors. They were overseen by female guild leaders, sometimes called Lingueres Yando or Mabroka, depending on the ethnic group. These weren't ceremonial figures. They set prices, resolved disputes, and managed trade alliances, and they reported to no man. You step around a collapsed wall. A faded strip of red pigment remains marking where a spice merchant once displayed her goods. You crouch and pick up a tiny clay disc, maybe a coin, maybe a weight used to measure gold dust. Here in the market, the queen was also an accountant. Mainstream history acknowledges West Africa's booming trade routes and the presence of elite women, but it often skims over the fact that entire market economies were essentially run by women. In some cities, male traders had to receive permission from female guilds to open stalls. Prices for salt cloth oil, cola nuts, and even livestock were negotiated in long sessions that sounded more like parliaments than business deals. You walk into the center of the square, where several stone foundations form a rough ring. This was likely a gathering place for senior merchant mothers. They sat in a circle, legs folded beneath them, with notebooks made of bark or leather, passing around cups of hibiscus tea and debating transport fees. They didn't shout, they calculated, slowly, precisely. Now, for your quirky detail, one market queen in Janae was known to carry a live turtle with her to every meeting, not because it was sacred, but because she said it reminded her to speak slowly and never make a promise she couldn't outrun. That turtle lived for over 60 years. So did her pricing policy. You circle the stones, imagining her voice low, measured, sharp when needed. Her influence wasn't written into royal decrees. It was woven into memory. Even when empires collapsed, the market remained, and her successors picked up where she left off. You duck under a beam, half buried in earth, and emerge into what would have been a side alley where smaller tradespeople sold goods off wagons and mats. Here's where politics got real. These women weren't just vendors, they were spies, negotiators, weather forecasters. One cloth seller might have memorized grain prices across 3 kingdoms. A salt merchant might know which caravan leaders were likely to delay and which ones carried extra guards. And through it all, the marketplace queens kept order. Historians still argue whether these women held de jure authority or simply wielded de facto power through custom and wealth. But legal records from later Mali suggest fines and contracts were often enforced by guild mothers, not city officials. One traveler noted that in Timbuktu, a foreign merchant who insulted a market matron was banned from all trade until he offered a public apology and 3 goats. You reach the edge of the market. To the north lies what used to be the dye pits, where indigo-stained hands and tunics dark blue. Women ran those pits too. In fact, most textile production was dominated by female workshops. The cloth these women produced was so prized that it was used as currency. You walk past one last row of sunken stalls, and there it is, a wide slab of stone, smooth from decades of sitting. The queen sat here, not on a throne, but on a bench worn soft by decision-making. She watched everything, the number of camels arriving, the time of day certain traders left, the weight of each bag. Her fingers moved, constantly counting, scribbling, adjusting. She didn't carry a weapon. She didn't need one. Her power wasn't physical. It was economic. And everyone, rulers included, knew better than to challenge that. And she wasn't alone. Most large Sahelian cities had similar women leading markets with the same quiet confidence. When kings made war, it was these women who decided whether supplies moved. When taxes were levied, they negotiated who paid how much. If a man tried to skirt protocol, they reminded him that without market blessing, even gold couldn't buy peace. You leave the market behind, the echoes of haggling and laughter still clinging to the air. You pass a fig tree, its trunk twisted like rope. Some say these trees remember voices. This one no doubt holds thousands. And as you climb the ridge on the far side, you take one last look back. The stalls are gone, the walls have crumbled, but the rules of trade, the rules she made, still guide commerce today. You move forward, the river is calling again, And so is another queen, one who ruled not from land, but from the water. You walk toward the river again, following the winding curve of a shallow inlet. The path narrows, choked by tall grasses and knotted roots. Somewhere to your left, a crocodile slips into the water without a sound. You pause, not out of fear, but out of respect. This is sacred territory, the watery domain of Djenné's guardian of the river. Djenné is ancient. Founded before the 9th century, it rose to fame not only for its massive mud brick mosque, but for its unmatched command of river trade. The Niger was its lifeline, and the woman who ruled from its banks didn't need armies to control her people. She had the current. Her name was Yana Warku, though depending on the dialect, it's spelled 10 different ways. She was not a queen in the palace sense. She didn't wear a crown or hold court in ivory halls. Instead, she ruled from a platform of sun-dried brick, elevated just above the wet season's reach, where she sat cross-legged and oversaw all movement in and out of Jenny's river port. You come to a clearing now flat and open its center, worn smooth by generations of footsteps. This was likely the staging ground where caravans were received. You imagine boats tied to palm posts, goods laid out on rush mats, taxes counted in handfuls of cowries. And in the middle, Yana Warku holding her ledger, wrapped in indigo and red, watching everything. Mainstream records of Djenné focus heavily on architecture and Islamic scholarship, especially the rise of the Great Mosque and the intellectual prestige of its clerics. What gets overlooked is the administrative machine behind that cultural explosion. And that machine ran on trade. Ivory, gold, salt, slaves, spices, manuscripts. Nothing moved without going through the docks. And nothing docked without Yana Warku's say-so. She knew every captain by name, every tariff by memory. She could recite from heart the average volume of a Tuareg trader's camel load, down to the fraction of a bundle. Her guards weren't soldiers, they were scribes with sharp eyes and sharper math skills. She trained them personally. A quirky detail emerges in several griot accounts she owned, a large calabash bowl said to float upright, no matter how heavily loaded. Visitors were told that if it ever tipped, it meant someone was lying about their cargo. During her rule, it never tipped. You hear the wind shift, and suddenly the river emerges before you. A wide, muddy ribbon cutting through the grassland, still powerful after all these centuries. A few canoes bob along the edge, modern and quiet. But your eyes focus on the far shore, where a line of crumbling foundations marks what used to be the Queen's processing station. She lived in a compound raised on packed mud and woven reed, just above flood level. It wasn't opulent, but it was intentional. From her window, she could watch every ship that passed. She didn't just tax goods, she regulated which cities could trade and which were banned. When a northern merchant broke a treaty and underpaid his levy, she didn't send soldiers. She sent word upriver. Within 2 days, his boats were denied docking space in every town, from Mopti to Gao. Historians still argue whether she acted with royal backing or independent authority. Djenné had a complicated governance structure, blending Islamic scholarship with local clan leadership and matrilineal practices. Some believe Yana Warku was appointed by royal decree. Others suggest she inherited her role through her mother, as had been custom long before Islam arrived. Either way, her influence was absolute. She was known for her fairness. Traders came from far-off routes, some traveling for weeks just to deal under her protection. She guaranteed market stability. She inspected cargo for fraud. She even arbitrated maritime disputes, sometimes personally paddling out to disputed boats with nothing but a staff and a pair of sharp eyes. You step down to the bank and scoop a handful of water. It's warm, murky, but alive. The river isn't a backdrop here. It's the reason this city thrived, and Yana Warku was its voice. At the height of her power, she enacted what scholars now call the River Code. It wasn't written, but everyone followed it. Boats that broke rank were denied access. Goods smuggled in without inspection were seized. Every crew had to offer a tithe, one item of value that would go to the women's guilds of Jenne. Not a bribe, a recognition of who kept the city running. Here's a small curious fact. One of her favorite tithes was rare ink. Traders brought indigo-dyed parchment imported from faraway cities just to stay in her good favor. She used that ink to annotate river records marking high tide levels, moon phases, and the weight of trade cycles. A few scraps of those ledgers still survive, ink faded but visible, her hand steady and small. You look upriver now. The sun catches the water just right, and for a moment it's easy to picture her again. Standing on her platform, one hand on her hip, the other holding a scroll. Traders bow slightly as they pass. She doesn't return the gesture. She just nods. Once. And that's enough. When she died, the riverbank remained silent for a full week. No boats launched, no goods moved. It was said the river itself mourned. You rise brushing wet clay from your palms. You leave the water behind, but the rhythm of her rule stays with you, tidal, measured, impossible to escape. Ahead lies the city itself, and deeper still the root of her power. Because in this land, lineage flows not just through blood, but through the matrilineal line. You move inland again. The river fades behind you, replaced by clusters of thick grass and the rustle of thorn trees. A few birds flap overhead, startled by your steps. The air carries a hint of wood smoke. You're climbing slightly now toward higher ground, where the earth lies flatter and the sky seems wider. This is where laws were decided, alliances were debated, and crowns were passed, not from father to son, but mother to daughter. You've entered the territory of the matrilineal secret. It doesn't shout. It doesn't announce itself with stone monuments or grand tombs, but it shaped the course of many Sahelian kingdoms more than any war. You step into what was once a royal compound, its floor long erased by time, but its influence buried deep in bloodlines. In several societies across the Sahel, particularly among the Sherer Wolof and parts of the Songhai succession, passed not through the male line, but the female. Power flowed laterally from king to his sister's son, not his own child. A king could be replaced, questioned, even removed. But the queen mother, her presence grounded the entire dynasty. You stop beneath a wide baobab tree. Its bark peels like ancient skin, its branches gnarled and quiet. Local tradition says baobabs remember everything. This one surely remembers her. She was called Neni Fadu, and she never wore a crown. But no decision passed without her breath behind it. Her son ruled a mid-sized Sahelian kingdom. During a turbulent century, one of droughts, famines, and endless negotiations with stronger neighbors. But it was his mother who determined who sat at his right hand. His mother who vetted the marriages. His mother who held the family griot's records and who summoned the council when crises emerged. And when he died, it was she who named the next ruler, her nephew, not her grandson, because that's how it worked. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Matrilineal systems in West Africa weren't fringe oddities. They were standard practice in many communities until the increasing spread of Islam and colonial influence altered inheritance, and governance norms. In matrilineal societies, women held legal ownership of land, controlled ceremonial roles, and played decisive parts in choosing leaders. You reach a low stone wall, now crumbling and half covered in moss. Behind it lies the remnants of what could have been a granary or a family shrine. Either way, it belonged to the matrilineal line. When harvests failed, offerings were left here, milk-ground millet pieces of cloth, meant not for gods, but for the spirits of the women who had kept the line strong. Now for a curious detail. Nene Fadu was known to carry a necklace of 7 teeth, each one taken from a lion her family had hunted across generations, not for violence, but for symbolism. The lions represented the strength of her female line. Each tooth was a name, each name a warning. Do not forget where power lives. You sit on the wall, the stone warm from the sun. In the distance you hear goats' bleating wind chimes clicking against wooden eaves. This land still remembers her rules. Even today, in pockets of Senegal and Mali, grandmother councils still resolve land disputes, approve marriages, and choose community leaders. Historians still argue whether matrilineality gave women more actual power or simply ceremonial prominence. But in the oral histories, the distinction doesn't matter. What matters is who remembers the lineage, who names the heirs, and who decides what the ancestors would have wanted. You walk toward a shaded alcove. At its center stands a single post, worn smooth by the hands of generations. This was where oaths were sworn. A would-be ruler stood here and named his mother's name aloud, then his grandmother's, then his great-grandmother's. Only after that could he speak of himself. And if he got one name wrong, the council walked away. You place your hand on the post. It's cool now, despite the sun. Smooth from memory, scarred from truth. In matrilineal Sahelian societies, queenship didn't require a throne, it required memory. The women kept the stories. They preserved the names. They decided who was legitimate. You could own a sword, a camel, and a fortress, but without their word, you ruled nothing. And it wasn't just royal families. In smaller villages, it was grandmothers who held court over disputes, who organized labor for planting, who oversaw divination rites before travel. A child's clan identity came from his mother. His sense of belonging came from her approval. You walk past what's left of a gate, just 2 vertical stones now with a hollow, where the crossbeam once rested. This was the passage to the inner compound. Only the matrilineal line could pass here during council meetings. Men waited outside. Even kings. They say Nene Fadu once stopped a civil war with a bowl of porridge. 2 cousins both claimed the throne. The council split. Swords were drawn. She prepared a single bowl of millet, placed it in the council chamber, and sat beside it in silence. When the men entered, they argued for hours. She never spoke. When they paused, she passed the bowl to the younger cousin. He ate. The elder cousin bowed. The war ended. You smile. Only a woman who knew her, line her power, and her people could do that without a word. And so as you leave the compound behind, stepping over old roots and buried bricks, you carry her secret with you. Not hidden, just quiet. The kind of strength that doesn't raise its voice but never forgets a name. You follow the wind eastward now. The land flattens again, and the soil underfoot grows damp. It hasn't rained, but your steps squish gently in soft earth. You're descending into a lowland, one of the many floodplains that border the great inland delta of the Niger. This is a place that shifts with the seasons. What's dry in March becomes a lake in August. What's visible now might be gone tomorrow. And somewhere in all this water and memory, you come to the story of the queen who vanished in the floodplain. She ruled a kingdom without borders, not because it lacked power, but because it moved with the river. Her people built homes on stilts, traveled by canoe, and grew rice in soil rich with silt. They were known as the Bozo, or sometimes the Somono river folk of the Sahel, who lived in rhythm with the water. And their queen understood the river better than anyone alive. Her name was Sira Koroma, and if you had asked her what her territory was, she wouldn't have answered with towns or maps. She would have pointed to the current. "Where the fish follow, I follow," she said once, according to a griot who told the tale to his grandson, who told it to his niece, who told it to a journalist, who didn't write it down. But you're here now, and that's enough. You pass a pool the size of a wagon. A few frogs leap into it as you approach. The reeds part, and the landscape opens up a long, flat expanse of silvery water reflecting the sun like a cracked mirror. In the middle distance, raised mounds emerge like islands. They were once homes, rice granaries, council huts, and maybe the queen's compound. Sira Koroma ruled from a floating court, literally. Her royal canoe was long enough to hold 20 people, and it housed a throne, a shrine, and a writing desk. She wore red beads in her hair and carried a polished paddle carved with symbols of past rulers. She could read fish migration like scripture and timed her decisions with the waxing moon. Mainstream scholars rarely mention her, but oral traditions from the Niger Delta preserve her memory with eerie clarity. During a year of intense flooding, possibly in the late 13th century, her kingdom expanded dramatically. Other groups displaced by water sought her protection. She offered it, but not for free. Her price, loyalty tribute, and a promise to respect the river's pace. She governed with a quiet, floating strength. Her advisors traveled with her, stopping at high points for meetings, ceremonies, and local disputes. One of her greatest achievements was establishing a flood calendar that guided planting for over 20 years. Farmers across dozens of villages relied on her timing. When she declared the rice could be planted, everyone listened. Now, for a fringe detail passed down by market women in the town of Mopti, they say she had a talking fish. Not a metaphorical one, a literal glistening catfish she kept in a water basin on her boat. They claim she whispered to it every morning and listened for bubbles. If the fish swam clockwise, she gave the go-ahead to travel. If not, she waited. The fish never failed her. She, in turn, never failed her people. You walk along the edge of one of the old mounds. Grass grows thick here. You find pieces of pottery rounded, ridged, and marked with tiny symbols, likely used to store rice or dried fish. Some still hold the faint scent of clay, and you notice the flood marks, high stains on tree trunks, grooves in rock. The water rose high once, very high. Then one year the queen vanished. Historians still argue whether her death was recorded or whether she was simply lost to the flood. Some say a seasonal surge swept her boat into open water during a storm. Others say she dissolved her court and became a spirit of the river, returning only to guide boats through fog. Her kingdom now submerged in sediment, and story didn't fall. It melted, absorbed into the shifting wetlands. You crouch beside a shallow pool. Small fish dart beneath the surface. You see her reflection there, not clearly, but enough to feel her presence. She doesn't rule anymore. She doesn't need to. The river remembers. In some villages, especially during flood season, elders still leave small offerings near the banks, a string of red beads, a carved paddle, a bowl of rice. They say it brings good harvests. or safe passage, or just peace. You rise and continue walking. The ground dries slightly as you move east. You look back only once. The sun is low now, and the mounds cast long shadows across the water. Somewhere beneath them are the remains of a floating kingdom and a queen who ruled without walls, armies or titles. Only the tide. You head north now, the air drier again, the grass thinning underfoot. Scrub brush lines the horizon, and every breeze brings with it a breath of sand. The desert is close, not full, Sahara yet, but the Sahel's quieter, harsher sibling. Here memory doesn't hide beneath water. It hides in parchment, in margin notes, in overlooked footnotes of Arabic texts written by men who thought the world revolved around kings and caliphs. You've arrived in the shadowy domain of hidden queens in Islamic histories. This part of the story doesn't shout, it whispers. Because the deeper you read the records, the more you realize someone's been carefully left out. The Sahelian kingdoms, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, eventually integrated with the Islamic world through trade, religion, and scholarship. Their rulers took on Islamic titles, invited clerics into their courts, and sent sons to study law in Timbuktu and Cairo. And yet in the margins of these stories, something strange happens. You keep seeing references to unnamed women, his mother who ruled in his youth, the elder sister who negotiated peace, a noble lady whose words calmed the court. They're never named, but they're everywhere. You stop at a half-buried mud structure, no more than a few collapsed walls now. This may have been a madrasa, once a religious school. Records show that women not only supported these institutions financially, but sometimes helped select their teachers. They even housed traveling scholars in family compounds. One letter from the 15th century thanks a noblewoman for arranging safe passage through her territory. The author never uses her name, only calls her the woman of influence. But she's there. Mainstream Islamic texts from the region, especially those written by travelers like Ibn Battuta or historians like al-Sadi, often sidestep powerful women. Whether out of cultural discomfort, religious framing, or just plain bias, they mention them obliquely. Yet if you follow the trail of property, ownership, trade, rights, and marriage alliances, it's clear queens operated just below the surface of official record. You walk on passing clusters of dried bushes and the stumps of what used to be acacia trees. Up ahead, a raised platform of stone sits like a small stage. This was likely a place of public judgment, a place where announcements were read and sentences delivered. Some griot accounts mention a queen known only as the woman of the veil. She wore dark cloth over her face in public, but her presence silenced the market when she passed. She was said to resolve disputes with one question and exile criminals with a gesture. She ruled during the height of Mali's Islamic consolidation, but no historian names her outright. She lives in fragments. A quirky local tale claims she kept a white rooster beside her at all times. If the rooster crowed before sunrise, she would cancel her appointments for the day. The spirits are unsettled, she'd say, and everyone obeyed. One morning the rooster vanished. She disappeared 2 days later. Historians still argue whether the veiled queen ever existed, or if she was a composite figure, one woman for many forgotten rulers. But her traits echo others. In the Tariq al-Fatash, a 17th century chronicle, a note appears in the margins of a political genealogy, the mother advised. No elaboration, no citation. But in the context of war and succession, a mother's advice was never idle. You enter what was once a prayer court, an open rectangular space framed by walls and aligned with the Qibla. It's mostly rubble now, but pieces of green ceramic tile catch the light. You step carefully. Women often funded these mosques. They purchased the tiles, hired the masons, and oversaw completion. One royal widow from Timbuktu, according to a fragment of a traveler's journal, delayed a mosque's construction because she didn't approve of the dome's curvature. She told the architect, "God sees from above. Make it beautiful." You smile at that. What these queens lacked in public recognition, they made up for in reach. They arranged marriages that shifted alliances. They lent gold to state treasuries in times of war. They gifted books to scholars and sent sons to study at Sankore University. Their names weren't engraved, but their decisions shaped generations. And even now, descendants of those lineages remember them. In small villages, some families trace their prestige not through male warriors, but through female patrons of Islam. Grandmothers tell stories of how the mosque came to be, how the flood stopped just shy of the village after the Queen's prayer, how a letter from her hand opened the road to Mecca. You stop beside an old well. Its stone lining is chipped, and the rope is gone, but the shape is unmistakable. Wells were often built under female supervision, part of a queen's duty to care for travelers and the poor. One account from the mid-1400s describes a ruler's mother who provided water, millet, and shelter for anyone on pilgrimage so long as they offered a prayer for her safe sleep. That well, they say, never ran dry. You scoop a handful of sand and let it run through your fingers. The wind picks up again. You hear faint voices, not real, not now, but the kind that linger when stories outlast structures. Somewhere out here behind the veil of history, the queens remain. You rise and continue walking. The next ruler awaits, not in shadows this time, but in armor. Her charms jingle with each step, and her enemies don't sleep well at night. You climb a rocky incline now where the Sahel's golden grasses give way to low hills and windswept stone. The air feels lighter here, quieter, more serious somehow. There are no markets, no rivers, no floodplains, just the solid earth and a few flat slabs of rock like platforms carved by time itself. This is where you encounter one of the most curious and least understood governing bodies in Sahelian history, the Council of Seven Sisters. No single queen ruled here. Instead, seven. Seven royal women, all from the same bloodline, each with distinct domains. One for justice, one for fertility, one for war, one for reign, one for trade, one for diplomacy, and one whose duty was simply to remember. Together they governed a region too vast for one monarch and too complex for a king's court. You stand now at the edge of what used to be their meeting site. A ring of stone seats half buried in sand still marks the space. You step into the center and feel the weight of consensus. The Seven Sisters were real, or at least the oral records insist they were. They ruled in a lesser-known Sahelian kingdom, possibly near the borders of modern-day Burkina Faso and Niger, sometime between the 11th and 13th centuries. Their names have long since vanished from official texts, but the structure of their leadership remains preserved in griot stories and clan customs. Mainstream history mostly ignores them. The colonial-era researchers who compiled early ethnographic accounts often dismissed these tales as symbolic or mythic. After all, how could a group of women govern anything without squabbling or chaos? That question, of course, reveals more about the researchers than the queens. You walk past the first seat-flat stone waist-high decorated with faded markings. This one was said to belong to the Sister of Rain. Her responsibility was to maintain the kingdom's seasonal rituals. She listened to the land, read sky omens, and coordinated with farmers. If planting began too early or too late, the entire harvest suffered. She timed it right for 32 years. Next is the Sister of Justice. Her seat is broader, cracked down the middle. She didn't speak much according to legend, but when she did, her words settled disputes like stones dropped into still water. No appeal was allowed once she rendered her verdict. Thieves feared her more than prison. You keep walking the ring. The Sister of War's seat is missing, but her presence lingers. A tale from a village elder recalls how she once brokered a peace treaty by setting her sword on the council table and saying, "We can trade words or wounds. Decide." The visiting emissaries chose words. Now, for a quirky detail during formal sessions, each sister wore a sash in her assigned color, but none wore shoes. This wasn't a spiritual rule. It was practical. The terrain was slippery with dust, and the council moved together as one. Bare feet made them quieter, more aware, more connected to the land. One griot quipped, "They ruled with silent steps and loud thoughts." Historians still argue whether the council system was an anomaly or an older governance model later overwritten by centralized kingship. The lack of stone inscriptions complicates things. Yet several clan groups still refer to their female elders as seated women, and some villages preserve the tradition of all women councils during the planting season. You reach the seventh seat, the one reserved for the Sister of Memory. Her role wasn't ceremonial, she was the archive. In her mind lived the entire history of her people births, battles, betrayals, and blessings, every law ever passed, every alliance ever forged. She spoke last in council, never first. She never interrupted. But when the others disagreed, she reminded them of precedent. Her voice was a ledger. Some stories say she carried a bowl of red dye and dropped a bead into it each time a council decision risked breaking ancestral law. If the dye grew too dark, the sisters paused their ruling and reconsidered. It only happened twice. You step outside the ring and turn to face it. The stones sit quietly in their weathered circle, but the wind around them swirls with gravity. These weren't symbolic women. They weren't wives of kings or priestesses in ceremonial roles. They governed, together, deliberately, with rules, with rituals, and with responsibility, and their decisions carried weight. One trade route was shifted westward after the Sister of Trade calculated that camel drivers were being overcharged by rival towns. One river crossing was deemed cursed by the Sister of Rain, and when the council voted to abandon it, flooding wiped it out 2 months later. Coincidence? Possibly. But the story lives on. One tale tells of a young man who tried to enter the council chamber, disguised as a servant. He wanted to overhear their decisions, hoping to gain an edge in a land dispute. The Sister of Justice saw through him immediately. She ordered him to walk to the nearest town barefoot, apologized to every woman he met along the way, and then returned to sweep the council floor for 7 days. He obeyed. When he died, he left half his land to the council. You start walking again, leaving the stone circle behind. The sun is dipping low, casting long shadows over the hills. You imagine the sister sitting there, shawls fluttering in the wind, eyes fixed on you, not judging, just watching, ensuring you remember, because they didn't write their rulings on scrolls. They wrote them in people, and those people told stories. You descend the hill now, where the wind dies down, and the stone gives way to sand once more. The shadows stretch longer across the plains, and your steps fall softer. You approach the remnants of fortified towns, sun-baked ruins whose walls once stood proud against invaders, rebels, and the relentless elements of the Sahel. This is the domain of the women of the sand fortresses, where queens held court behind thick walls of clay, not to hide, but to rule. The city is quiet now. Just the skeleton of what used to be outlines of compounds, broken archways, a gate half buried in dust. But once this place rang with the clatter of hooves, the slam of wooden doors, and the steady rhythm of drums calling people to gather. You step through the ghost of a market square and pass into what might have been the Queen's Court. This wasn't a palace of marble, no gold domes, just thick walls, smooth and strong, built from banco mud mixed with straw and hardened under the sun. Perfect for insulating against the heat. You run your hand along a remaining section, feeling its warmth. You're not in a ruin, you're in a strategy. These women ruled with permanence in mind. One such ruler was Hawa Tandina, queen of a fortified desert city near the bend of the Niger. She was not born to rule. She rose through clever negotiation, marrying a minor noble to secure position, then outliving him and orchestrating a bloodless takeover. She wasn't flashy, she was effective, and she built her fortress for governance, not grandeur. Her compound had 4 towers, each one facing a cardinal direction. One tower served as a courtroom, another held storage, a third trained scribes and tax collectors. The last hers was a private chamber filled with maps, grain records, and tribute lists. She met ambassadors there, behind closed doors, with no interruptions. Mainstream history doesn't often highlight the architectural sophistication of female-led fortresses, but many Sahelian towns show evidence of carefully zoned compounds designed for administration, not just protection. These weren't temporary camps. They were administrative centers, and women like Hawa Tandina made sure every corridor had a purpose. You pass a rectangular depression in the earth, once a courtyard likely. One griot describes this exact place, claiming that Hawa held weekly open councils here, where any subject could bring complaints. A drum would beat 3 times to signal her entrance. No one spoke before she did. Her guards, female, trained and loyal, stood around the perimeter, not to intimidate, but to remind everyone who truly kept order. Now for your quirky detail. Hawa reportedly owned an ostrich. Not as a pet, but as an alarm system. The bird was trained to shriek whenever unfamiliar footsteps entered the fortress compound. It only shrieked once during her 20-year rule, when a spy posed as a washerwoman. The ostrich saved her life. Historians still debate how widespread female fortress rule was. Some argue that women inherited such strongholds only temporarily, as regents, until a son came of age. But in Hawa Tandina's case, she ruled until her death, and her daughter succeeded her without contest. Local archives, written later by scribes trained in Islamic legal systems, mention the great woman who set the grain price, and her daughter who knew the wind schedule. You climb a set of worn stairs, half swallowed by sand. They lead to a platform, perhaps once a watchtower. From here you can see the outlines of roads that once led outward, one north to the salt mines, one east to trade towns, one west to rice fields, and one south to the river crossing. Each direction watched over by her fortress. This wasn't isolation, this was management. Inside her walls, Hawa coordinated supply chains, oversaw tax rotations, and hosted councils of merchants from as far as Tagaza. She issued letters of safe passage marked with a handprint dipped in indigo dye, her seal. And those letters worked. Even bandits left them alone. She trained her staff meticulously. Each scribe was expected to know not just how to write, but how to anticipate. If a grain shipment was late, the scribe needed 3 answers ready: what happened, how to recover, and how to prevent it next year. Mistakes were corrected, not punished, but repeated incompetence that earned a demotion to courtyard sweeping duty for a year. You move into what's left of a meeting chamber. Its walls curve slightly inward, creating a natural amplification of sound. Smart design. Hawa used it to hold court without shouting. Her advisors sat on mats woven by widows, another policy of hers employing women displaced by war in royal service. The mats bore red thread borders, symbol of her household. The records say she never raised her voice. She didn't need to. When conflict arose between 2 local tribes over grazing rights, she settled it not by dividing the land, but by requiring shared stewardship with rotating seasons. She said, "If the land can take turns resting, so can you." Her judgment stuck. Even now, some herders in that region still honor the grazing cycle she set 1,000 years ago. As the sun sinks lower, you walk back down the stairs and past the main gate. A faded carving is barely visible. On the upper lintel, a half sun over a flat horizon. Her emblem. Some say it symbolized balance. Others say it meant control of both light and shadow. Whatever it meant, she lived by it. You step outside the ruined walls and look back. No domes, no pillars, just the quiet strength of mud and design. A fortress made not for war, but for rule, and ruled by a woman who knew every crack in its walls and every weakness in her rivals. And ahead, a different kind of leader, one lost not to time or battle, but buried between lines in someone else's story. You follow the edge of the floodplain, walking along cracked sediment that looks as though it still remembers water. This land is tricky, never quite dry, never quite stable. The wind here feels different. Not just cooler, but cautious, as if it's avoiding something. You've come to search for a ruler whose disappearance wasn't announced with trumpets or remembered in marble, but whispered across generations. This is where you search for the queen who vanished in the floodplain. The floodplain stretches ahead, wide and hushed. Tall grass sways in slow rhythm, and the mud under your soles sinks slightly, refusing to give full support. Still, you press on your steps, following a barely visible path, just a suggestion of direction, among a landscape that changes every season. The queen's name was Sira Karoma, and she ruled not from a throne atop stone stairs, but from a long canoe carved from Iroko wood and painted in streaks of blue and white. Her court was mobile, her soldiers oarsmen, her territory liquid. In the delta region of the Niger, where land and water blur into each other like watercolor left in the rain, she governed people who lived by fishing, trading, and reading the flood cycles like gospel. You step beside a pool of stagnant water where frogs croak in discordant harmony. The smell of moss fish and wet bark fills the air. This was her home, a realm that breathed and shifted. The people called her the daughter of the current, and she knew every twist of the river, every safe channel, every island that would vanish by dusk. Mainstream historians rarely name her directly. Few chronicles document her actions, and none survive in formal archives. But griots in the Bozo communities of central Mali remember her well. They tell of a queen who led flotillas of traders, settled disputes, between fishing clans and negotiated water rights like land treaties. She was known for resolving arguments by drawing invisible lines in the current and commanding both sides to keep to their half. Everyone obeyed. Even the river, they said. One of her lasting legacies was the introduction of a floating tax station, a wide raft staffed by scribes, protected by guards, and anchored at the center of major trade junctions. Traders would paddle up, declare their goods, and receive a stamped clay tag proving they'd paid. No tag, no access to safe ports. The system endured long after she disappeared. Now for a fringe detail, elders in a nearby village still sing a lullaby said to be hers. It's a low, gentle melody used to calm infants and restless traders alike. The lyrics describe a woman calling to a stubborn river asking it to slow down so her people could cross. The melody changes subtly depending on the direction you're paddling. Downstream it lilts. Upstream it drags. Even songs in her world obeyed geography. You walk through a hollow in the reeds and find a ridge of dry land barely a few feet wide. This is one of the Toguna sacred resting places used by river travelers. Sira Karoma had them placed every 10 miles along common routes. They offered shelter, water, and firewood. In return, travelers were expected to leave a story carved on a gourd or scratched into bark. A traveling court, after all, needed to know the stories it floated past. One such carved gourd survives in the hands of a griot's great-granddaughter. It's small, worn, and cracked at the edges, but it bears a distinct symbol, a canoe and a fish crossed by a line that scholars interpret as return. Some believe it was a farewell. Others think it was a promise. Historians still argue about her disappearance. Some suggest she drowned during an unusually harsh flood season. Others suspect political betrayal and ambush orchestrated by rivals jealous of her growing influence. Still others propose something quieter, that she chose to vanish, sailing into the river's mouth alone, leaving no body, no boat, no heirs, only questions. And yet her absence didn't lead to chaos. Her policies were so deeply embedded that her officials continued to govern in her name for at least a generation. Her rice planting calendar remained in use. Her floating tax stations kept functioning. A queen gone but not undone, you kneel now beside a stretch of hardened silt. Pieces of pottery crunch underfoot, fragments of bowls and jars, some with decorative grooves. These may have been her quartz utensils. You brush aside debris and find the imprint of a woven reed mat, fossilized into the ground. Maybe she sat here. Maybe she shared a meal with her crew here, laughing, planning the next phase of a tax reform no one saw coming. You rise and gaze toward the far edge of the floodplain, where the reeds thicken again. There's no monument to her here, no statue, but you remember what one griot said. She was a boat with no anchor. She moved because we needed her to. In some ways, her disappearance only deepened her legend, not through grief, but through continuity. Each year, on the anniversary of the Great Flood, local fishermen still place offerings in the river bowls of rice, strings of red beads, folded leaf charms bearing the shape of a fish. They don't pray for her return. They thank her for never truly leaving. You walk now through a shallow path cut into the grass leading back toward firmer land. Behind you, the water whispers against the banks. The frogs start again. Overhead, a heron circles twice, then glides silently into the reeds. And just before you step out of the floodplain, you pause. In the corner of your eye, a shadow moves across the water. A canoe, a cloud. It vanishes before you can be sure. But something within you believes. You climb slowly now out of the marshland and back into the sun-dried ridges that roll across the Sahel like waves made of dust. The reeds fall away behind you, replaced by acacia trees and spindly shrubs that tremble in the breeze. Your feet press into firmer ground again, and ahead set against a line of jagged stone you see what remains of a once thriving scriptorium, a place where words were copied, records kept, and truths carefully edited. You're walking into the quiet, dusty corridor of hidden queens in Islamic histories. Here the stories are faint. They're not missing but nearly erased. They survive only in margins, footnotes, and the uncertain hands of men who weren't quite sure what to do with powerful women in their records. This is Timbuktu territory now, the intellectual heart of West Africa during the 14th to 16th centuries. Its universities and mosques were legendary. Its scholars renowned across the Islamic world, but in the thousands of surviving documents, legal contracts, royal decrees, fatwas, treatises, you notice something strange. Women are mentioned often with respect, but ruling women, female monarchs, political authorities, they vanish between the lines. You pass under what's left of a colonnade, 4 pillars of crumbling mud brick, their bases reinforced with stone. This was once part of a madrasa, a religious school where students recited Quranic verses until their voices cracked. Some of those students were women, others were the sons of women who funded the schools, built their libraries, and housed their teachers. You kneel beside a broken slab of engraved stone. The inscription is mostly chipped away, but one line remains legible: Wa umuhu. And his mother, that's all. No name, no detail. But in the context of Sahelian Islamic dynasties, that line often means more than it lets on. Mainstream records from scholars like Al-Sadi, author of the Tariq al-Sudan, mention many rulers. They detail their lineages, battles, and policies. But when a woman takes the stage, she's often described obliquely: the mother who held court in his absence, the elder sister who preserved the treasury, the widow who managed the kingdom's affairs. They're rarely given titles, almost never names, but their fingerprints are everywhere. You step into a shaded alcove walls covered in faint calligraphy. One griot's account from the outskirts of Gao tells of Amina bint Fari, a woman who governed her son's province while he studied in Egypt. For 5 years, she managed tax collection, enforced court rulings, and arranged diplomatic marriages, all under her son's name. When he returned, she stepped down quietly. Her name appears only once in surviving documents, in a letter of thanks written by a merchant who never met her. May the mother who kept peace be remembered. Now for your fringe tidbit in some households. In Timbuktu, especially among elite merchant families, women maintained private archives. Scrolls, letters, records of trade, all stored in clay jars sealed with beeswax. These jars were sometimes buried under sleeping platforms for safekeeping. One such archive unearthed in the 1980s contained over 40 documents. 10 were signed or annotated by women. 3 had seals attributed to a female magistrate known only by her honorific Almara al-Kabira, the Great Woman. You move deeper into the ruins. A rectangular platform lies ahead, blackened with age and heat, likely a teaching bench. Here lessons were repeated aloud, carved into memory. A nearby stairwell leads into what may have been a storage room. You duck inside, brushing cobwebs from your face. The walls are lined with empty niches where manuscripts once sat, safe from the sun, the wind, and the knowledge-hungry hands of colonizers who carted thousands away. And yet in the oral traditions of the region you hear names the documents forgot. Jamila of Janneh said to have held her husband's court while he made pilgrimage. Fatimata Kondo, who was not only literate in Arabic but also wrote letters to Songhai generals during a time of civil dispute. The Lady of Bamba, who refused to remarry after her husband's death and instead ruled his lands herself for 2 decades, referred to in legal records only as the matron. Historians still argue whether these women held formal political power or acted solely within informal networks. But when decisions are enforced, letters are answered, and armies stand down. At a woman's request, the difference between formal and informal begins to blur. You step back into the sunlight. The courtyard ahead is almost empty, just 3 stumps where trees once grew. In Sahelian tradition, these courtyards were where community judgments were held. Some judges were men, others were women, especially in periods when Islamic and local traditions blended. One griot tells of a widow who issued fatwas, religious rulings, from her veranda. They called her the mouth of the mosque. The local imam debated her once. He lost. A curious side note, women in Timbuktu often controlled waqf endowments, donations of property or money used for religious or charitable purposes. Through these endowments, women shaped local economies, influenced mosque governance, and funded schools. They held no royal title. But without their gold, the kingdoms didn't run. You pass a low wall etched with symbols, many geometric, a few floral. Here women sat in the evenings weaving cloth and telling stories. Some of those stories weren't fairy tales. They were lessons, warnings, blueprints for survival. When the river eats the road, one says build on sand. A proverb, but also a political strategy. And the queens. They moved through those stories not as ghosts or fantasies, but as forces, unnamed in texts, remembered in song, omitted by scholars, honored by their descendants. You stop now at a simple stone slab half sunken in the earth. No script, no name, just smooth gray silence. But someone placed it here. Someone buried a truth beneath it. You press your hand to the stone and whisper the question, "Who were you?" And in the wind that answers, you hear hundreds of names, all left out of the book, but never forgotten. You walk on. The earth becomes dustier, lighter, the colors more muted. Hazy wind stirs the air, and in the distance you hear the jangle of something metallic. You follow the sound, drawn to a rise of reddish stone overlooking a dry plain, where paths cross like a woven mat. At the summit, the air clears, and there, etched faintly into the rock beneath your feet, you find a single symbol, a hand gripping a spiral. You've arrived in the realm of the amulet-wearing generaless. Her name was Khadija Sangare, and she was not born into peace. She was forged in tension, rising during a time when rival Sahelian factions clashed, not only for land, but for honor. Unlike many of the queens you've met so far, Khadija didn't build cities, preserve lineages, or rule courts. She commanded armies. Her soldiers called her the one who does not bleed. They said she fought without fear and slept beneath the stars, her spear always within reach, her charms tied close to her body. She was covered in them wrist to elbow, ankle to knee, copper spirals, bone fragments, dried seeds sealed in leather pouches. Every charm had a purpose. Every charm had a cost. You pass a ring of stones, flattened by time. This was likely her encampment. It faced east toward the rising sun, an omen of strength in local cosmology. Every morning she stood at its edge overlooking her troops, inspecting their faces. If one looked away, they were sent back. If one wavered in breath, they were replaced. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her gaze was enough. Mainstream records from the region don't dwell much on her. She appears in military tallies as the commander's mother or the woman who led the third flank. But oral accounts from Dogon villages describe her as the reason the third flank survived. When a rival army ambushed her convoy near the cliffs of Bandiagara, she deployed smoke signals using crushed termite nest dust and buried her cavalry in a sand pit waiting for dusk. Her men rose like ghosts, silent, and routed the enemy. She lost only one soldier. That night she buried him herself. Historians still argue whether she held a formal title. Some suggest she was a field marshal under a lesser-known Sahelian chief. Others claim she was self-made, rising from the ranks after her husband's death in battle. What's consistent is this: her forces followed her, without question. You walk into a shallow ravine carved by centuries of foot traffic and runoff. The walls bear scratch. Marks, some ritual, some record. One long sequence depicts 3 animals, a lion, a vulture, and a gazelle, each one tied to a star shape. This was her insignia, not written in words but in movement. She once said, "A lion strikes from strength, a vulture from patience, a gazelle from silence. I carry all 3." And she did. You reach a small outcrop of boulders where offerings are still left, bits of cloth, charred wood, millet cakes. A local tradition survives here. Before long, Journey's travelers pause to speak her name 3 times while facing east. Khadija, Khadija, Khadija. Not to summon her, but to borrow her courage. Now for a quirky detail, she was said to carry a tiny bell, no larger than a fingernail, sewn into the hem of her tunic. When battle began, she shook it once, not to signal, but to remind herself that fear was just sound. Then she silenced it with a pinch of mud and charged. Her army wasn't large, never more than 200 fighters, but they were disciplined, tight-knit, bound by rituals of loyalty and protection. Each soldier wore an amulet, a replica of one of hers, chosen in a ceremony that mixed ancestral blessings with battlefield oaths. If you broke your oath, you returned your amulet and left forever. Very few ever did. You climb higher, now tracing the path she would have taken to scout the land. From here, the horizon stretches endlessly. You see rivers in the distance, barely visible like threads of light. She used the terrain as a weapon, memorized migration patterns of game, the cycles of grasses. Her tactics weren't taught. They were learned from years of watching. In the heart of her command compound stood a circle of spears, 24, in all one for each major conflict she fought. After each victory, she planted one. The spears are gone now, lost to rust and theft, but the impressions remain, indentations in a perfect ring. You step into it. The air is still. The wind pauses. This was where she knelt, hands resting on her thighs, waiting for judgment from her own warriors. After each campaign, she asked them to tell her what she'd done wrong. They were required to answer. If 3 or more agreed on a failure, she issued a public apology. Strength wasn't perfection, it was accountability. You find a final mark etched lower on a stone half covered in lichen. A spiral within a spiral. Her burial symbol. They say she was not entombed, but left in the desert wrapped in cloth and salt. Her amulets removed and buried in 7 different locations, so no one person could claim her power. She wanted no cult, only memory. And it worked. Her name still travels among women warriors in the Sahel, especially those who train in secret. Groups of nomadic women who carry knives, who know how to break a camel's charge, who speak in code across firelight. They invoke her not as queen or general, but as sister, a sister who never blinked. You descend again, the stones behind you, the plain stretching ahead. You carry nothing physical with you, no charm, no blade, but your spine feels straighter, your pace steadier. Her lesson is simple: wear your protection where they expect weakness, lead without needing volume. And when the battle comes, shake the bell once and then silence it. You travel into the flatlands now, where the Sahel opens like a fan beneath the wide sky. The ground feels cracked beneath your feet, the air thinner but not empty. There's something here, something light, almost musical, carried in the wind. Ahead, a small stone enclosure lies half buried in ochre dust. It was never a palace, it was a paddock. And tonight, you're stepping into the story of the queen whose horses listened to her. Her name was Nabu Yasin, and the people said she could tame any stallion with a whisper. The Sahel prized horses, not just for war, but for status trade and speed. They were the difference between survival and conquest, between tribute and theft. And while many men trained as horsemen from youth, only a few ever commanded the full respect of a war-trained horse. Fewer still could do what Nabu did, walk into a paddock full of bucking, foam-slicked stallions and make them lie down with a word. Mainstream historians have little to say about her. She doesn't appear in most chronicles or genealogies, but the griots tell it differently. They say she ruled a small cavalry-based city-state on the northern edge of the Senegal River basin, where dust storms were common and grass was sparse. She came to power not through bloodline, but through bond between herself and the animals no one else could control. You reach the paddock, or what's left of it, 4 stone posts arranged in a square, each marked with carvings, spirals, hoof prints, a circle split into 4. This is where she stood, in the early light arms, crossed her braided hair, falling over her shoulders. She didn't shout, she waited. And one by one the horses came to her. She ruled differently. Where other leaders formed councils of men, she kept her court outdoors. Her generals were all riders, her advisors horse breeders, saddle makers, messengers who'd ridden the desert at night. She communicated with her inner circle using signals drawn from riding: a flick of the fingers, a tapping of the boot, a shift in breath. Everything was motion, everything was trust. Now for a curious detail, she had a saddle carved from a single block of acacia wood. It was said to be so well balanced that a rider could sleep in it without falling. She never traveled without it, and no one else was allowed to sit in it. When asked why, she answered simply, "Because it knows my back." You pass a worn trail leading away from the paddock. The dirt here is scored with hoof marks, long faded but visible beneath the grass. Nabu was known to ride at dawn alone with no guards. She listened for changes in the rhythm of the land, a silent stretch where birds should be, an odd wind from the south, too much dust on the grass. These were her intelligence networks. Her enemies sent spies. She sent mares. Her horses weren't ordinary. They were trained to detect falsehood literally. If a diplomat approached and said one thing but felt another, the horses would react: a snort, a stomp, a refusal to approach. One tale says a rival emissary came to propose a treaty. Nabu's lead mare refused to allow him within 10 paces. The queen declined the treaty. A week later, word arrived. His people had prepared an ambush. Historians still argue whether Nabu Yassin ruled a true political entity or a semi-nomadic federation that shifted with the seasons. Some believe she held the title of Alpha, a term used in some Fulani regions for a spiritual military leader. Others say she was more shaman than sovereign, a woman who blurred the line between warcraft and animal kinship. But what can't be denied is her impact. Local horse breeding practices trace back to her stables. A riding style called the silent seat is still taught in some northern Senegalese communities where the rider's spine aligns exactly with the horse's. No kicking, no pulling, just breath. You climb a gentle slope now. Where a watchtower once stood, the wind is stronger here. You can see the vast open plain where her cavalry once assembled. One griot said they moved like wind-blown fire, silent, fast, and always changing shape. Her riders used minimal armor, just padded vests and amulets tied to the reins. They carried short bows and long whips. They were known to dismount mid-charge if the terrain demanded it, because they trusted her, and she trusted the horses. Now for a fringe tidbit, you won't find in formal records the queen supposedly fed her mounts a blend of fermented millet and honey before battle. It calmed them, or as she put it, reminded them they were loved. That detail makes military historians raise eyebrows, but the oral accounts insist on it, and her soldiers, they swore by it. You step into a grove of thorny trees, one of the few shaded spots nearby. In the center, a carved stone marks her resting place. Not a grave, no bones were buried here, but a place to remember her, a smooth disc, waist high, with a horseshoe carved into the top. Visitors still come. They bring offerings, not coins or food, but hair from their horses braided and tied with red thread. One griot says that if you whisper your question to the stone and it echoes, the queen has heard you. And what would you ask her? How to lead without commanding. How to trust the invisible. How to move a crowd without words. Or maybe just how did you make them listen? You leave the grove and walk back into the open. The plain ahead stretches wide and empty, but you don't feel alone. The wind brushes your shoulder. Somewhere in the distance you hear a faint snort, a rustle, a thud like hooves on dry ground. Nothing visible, just presence. And you realize her lesson was never about horses. It was about rhythm, connection, respect. She didn't control the wild, she harmonized with it. And now so do you. You walk through the dry silence of the open plain until the earth beneath your feet grows redder, finer. The dust clings to your sandals, and the wind carries it in slow swirls across a path that seems to shift with every step. Here in this place where travel itself was once perilous and promises had the weight of survival, you arrive at the heart of one of the Sahel's most calculated power moves, the Desert Marriage Alliance. The queen you seek here was no warrior, no rider, no whisperer of horses. Her domain was diplomacy, her legacy, a marriage that turned two warring desert tribes into a single trading empire. Her name was Halima Touré, and her power lay in knowing when to hold her silence and when to speak. The Sahelian landscape, especially near the borders of present-day Mauritania and northern Mali, was shaped by intertribal rivalry. For centuries, camel caravans passed between oases and salt gold, and enslaved labor moved with them. So did grudges. Entire seasons of conflict erupted over water access, grazing rights, and caravan tolls. Into this came Halima Young, strategic, and born into one of the lesser clans along a tributary of the Senegal River. Mainstream history records the alliance she forged, but rarely credits her role in it. They mention the union of the two great families in passing, noting the resulting peace treaties. The uptick in trade, the sudden coordination between border guards and caravan leaders. But it was Halima who engineered it down to the seating arrangements. You come to a low escarpment overlooking a shallow Wadi Dry for now, but etched with the memory of water. Below it, a grove of date palms grows against all odds. This, oral tradition says, was where the first negotiations began. Halima camped here for 4 days, refusing to move until both tribal elders arrived. She refused shelter, ate only millet and honey, spoke no word of greeting until all parties sat. Her offer was simple. She would marry the heir of the desert clan, not out of love, but as equal partner. The terms were detailed shared control of key watering stations, alternating tax collection years on trade routes, and the founding of a joint settlement neutral to both clans. In exchange, she required one thing: the right to raise their first child in her homeland, not his. He agreed. Now for the quirky part, the wedding took place at dusk, under a canopy of dyed goat hides, stitched together by both clans' women. The fabric colors alternated red for her side, indigo for his. One elder woman who attended claimed that Halima wore a necklace made of camel teeth, each one from a different season's lead animal, representing the years of travel now put behind them. You pass what may have been the ceremonial platform, a ring of stones set in perfect symmetry. At the center, a depression in the ground where a fire once burned through the night. The griots say that flames were fed not with wood, but with treaty scrolls from both sides, symbols of the old ways. The ashes were collected in clay jars and buried at the corners of the new settlement. The marriage worked, trade flourished, border skirmishes stopped. Within 10 years, Halima and her husband oversaw what was effectively a mini-state with its own tax system, militia, and judicial council. And Halima She was no silent partner. She chaired the court on alternating days. She negotiated external trade deals with forest merchants and desert nomads. Her correspondence, carried in leather satchels across the dunes, became famous for their brevity and precision. Historians still argue whether Halima Touré's influence was political or merely symbolic. Some accounts refer to her as the Lady of the Alliance, others as she who binds dust to dust. But local memory holds firm she ruled, not just beside her husband, but sometimes above him. When he fell ill, she assumed control without challenge. When he died unexpectedly, she installed her sister's son as his successor, bypassing several male cousins, not out of favoritism, out of strategy. You reach the remnants of a council hall, square foundation, stones a carved threshold, the faded remains of what may have been storage pits. This was where disputes between the two clans were resolved for decades after the marriage. Halima chaired these courts from a woven mat at the center. Her method? Each side spoke once. She interrupted no one. When they finished, she asked 3 questions, all beginning with, "What will happen if?" And based on the answers, she made her decision. Her decisions held. Now for another fringe detail, she never bore more than 1 child. Intentionally. When asked why, she answered 1 heir is strategy, 2 is politics. Her son was raised among her people as promised and grew to become a renowned judge and scholar. When he returned to the desert, he ruled not through force, but by quoting her judgments, word for word. You sit beneath one of the palms. The wind through the fronds sounds almost like whispering silk. And in the dry heat, you imagine her there robed in light fabric, hands folded, eyes always watching, not hoping, calculating, because Halima Touré wasn't romantic, she was realistic. She saw what 2 warring groups could never build alone and found a way to make them choose unity. You rise. The path continues toward a deeper desert, and waiting out there is another queen. Not a diplomat, not a writer, but a woman who took grief and made it a dynasty. The land ahead is pale and cracked, the kind of terrain that crunches underfoot even when dry wind is the only thing moving. You step into it carefully, feeling the full silence of the Sahel settle over your shoulders. No frogs, no birds, no rustling trees, just the slow stretch of time across a hardened plain. And at the center of this silence, you find the story of the widow who became a dynasty. Her name was Mariama Koba, and she began as a consort married to a mid-ranking chief who controlled a small border territory between two greater Sahelian states. By all appearances, her role was secondary. She bore 3 children, managed household affairs, received traders in the inner courtyard, but when her husband died unexpectedly, her role shifted overnight, and so did history. In the days after his death, rival claimants emerged, each with some vague tie to the bloodline or military. There was confusion, arguments, threats. But Mariama didn't cry. She didn't plead. She didn't even call for a council. She simply shut the gates. For 3 days, no one entered or left the compound. And on the 4th, she emerged wearing her husband's seal, a carved ivory pendant, usually worn during court sessions. And she stood before the people and said only one thing: he left no heirs stronger than me. And no one disagreed. Mainstream history tends to overlook Mariama's reign, perhaps because it began without formal coronation, or because her early rulings were signed not with her name, but on behalf of the line. But in the Sahelian oral record, her decisions shaped an entire generation of border stability. You arrive at the outer edge of her former capital, a place once known as Koba Kunda, the home of Koba. Only its foundations remain now, a series of stone footings, the layout of courtyards still faintly visible. You cross what used to be the main gate. The hinges are gone, but the pathway remains a wide clearing lined with clay bricks, hardened to the consistency of stone. She ruled from within, not from atop. Her first acts were simple: restructure the grain storage system to prevent waste, standardize trade tolls along river crossings, and formalize a widows' council, giving legal voice to women who, like her, had lost husbands in battle or illness. It became a political force of its own. One male rival called it the silent court, but others called it by its true name, the mother's hand. Now, for a quirky detail, Mariama was known to keep a bowl of smooth pebbles beside her at all times. Each morning she added 1 pebble for every good decision made the previous day by her advisors, or even local traders. If the bowl reached full before the month ended, she gifted it to a village elder, a merchant, or even a child who had shown kindness. If it didn't, she scattered the pebbles across the courtyard and started again. She believed in daily accountability. You walk now to the inner compound, a rectangular shape formed by foundation stones, marks where the royal chamber once stood. Local memory holds that she slept on a woven mat, not a raised platform, and used no curtain to separate herself from her aides. She rose with the sun. She wrote her rulings by hand, not through scribes, though she later trained young girls to take dictation. Historians still argue whether her dynasty began with intention or necessity. Some claim she ruled only until her son came of age, but others note that even after her son inherited the title, she continued to issue policy. She sat at council. She hosted dignitaries. Her voice didn't retire, it amplified. and her descendants ruled for nearly 80 years. You pause at a corner of the compound where a single wall remains standing 3 meters tall, its surface etched faintly with symbols. One resembles a hand, the other a millet stalk. Locals interpret this as her legacy, nurture, and command in equal measure. One traveler during the early 16th century described meeting a woman in a house of thick shadow where all decisions are weighed like gold. He never named her. But his description, her posture, her words, the room matches the oral record of Mariama's later years. She ruled from within that shadow, never seeking light, only precision. Now, for a lesser-known fact, she was one of the first rulers in her region to implement a mobile archive scrolls and records transported between villages by trained carriers. She refused to rely on griots alone. Memory is sacred, she once said, but paper remembers what people try to forget. You pass a circular pit lined with stones. It was once a cooking hearth, but Mariama repurposed it into a meeting circle. Every full moon, she sat there with village women and asked them to bring one story of loss or survival or gratitude. She said policy must begin where pain begins. And when she died, the entire court fasted for 3 days. Her mat was burned, her seal crushed. But her bowl of pebbles, it was buried beneath the threshold of the council chamber, so that every decision passed through it. You turn to leave the site, but before you go, you find one last marker, a half-buried stone near the outer wall, engraved simply with the word Koba. Nothing more, no titles, no praise, just the name she built into a lineage. Because Mariama Koba didn't seize power, she filled a silence others were too afraid to enter, and by doing so she created space for order, for memory, for a dynasty of steady hands. You walk back to the path feeling the stones shift beneath you, and ahead through the evening light another story waits. One not of triumph, but of disappearance, of queens buried not in graves, but in time itself. You move slowly now, the light fading into a deep golden blur along the edge of the sky. The Sahel seems to stretch wider at dusk, like the land itself is exhaling after a long, hot day. Crickets begin to stir. The air grows cooler, and your shadow stretches long behind you. You're not following a path anymore, just instinct, a soft sense that you're nearing the edge of something. And then you see it, a single stone pillar, standing crooked in the earth, surrounded by nothing but space and silence. This is where we find echoes beneath the Sahel sky. This isn't a place of ruins. There are no foundations, no walls, no broken doors or shrines. The queens who ruled here left no structures behind, but their echoes remain held in dust, in rhythm, in breath. You sit on the ground beside the pillar, your fingers tracing faint grooves in its surface, maybe writing, maybe wind erosion. It doesn't matter. What matters is what isn't here, names, records, symbols. This is where the trail of queens grows quiet, not because they didn't exist, but because their stories were never written. Or if they were, someone later decided to erase them. Mainstream scholarship has long wrestled with the silences in Sahelian history. The accounts we have, travelogues from Ibn Battuta court, records from Timbuktu chronicles like the Tariq al-Sudan, are detailed, rich, and revealing. But they are also overwhelmingly male. Male rulers, male scribes, male warriors. The women, they become shadows. His wife, the elder, a noble woman, hints of power, never its full shape. You rise and walk slowly in a circle around the pillar. No other markers appear. But the air feels charged, like sound, lingers here even after voices are gone. Griots remember fragments. In one village, an elder speaks of a queen whose name cannot be spoken aloud, only hummed in a specific key. In another, a child's lullaby tells of a woman who planted cities like seeds. In yet another, a tale of a queen who judged by listening to heartbeats. No names, no dates, but something is there. Now for a quirky detail. In some Sahelian communities, women used to carve tiny notches into the handles of their cooking spoons, one for each wise decision made during market exchanges. These spoons were passed down generation to generation. One anthropologist counted over 70 notches on a spoon that hadn't stirred a pot in 200 years, and the family who held it descendants of a queen, whose name had long been lost. You stop walking. The wind is rising again, carrying with it a fine layer of dust, the kind that settles quickly but never fully disappears. You close your eyes and listen, not for words, for patterns. There's a rhythm here, a pulse beneath the soil. It moves like memory, uneven, imperfect, but persistent. Historians still argue why so many Sahelian queens vanished from official record. Was it cultural erasure driven by later patriarchal norms? Was it the rise of Islamic scripturalism, which often favored male succession in its texts? Or was it something quieter, a failure to recognize power when it didn't look like a crown? Whatever the reason, the silence is real, but it's not empty. You kneel again, brushing your palm across the earth. Beneath your hand is hard-packed clay, the kind used in old courtyards and council floors. You're not standing in nothing. You're standing in what remains. A meeting place, a decision point, a center of something that once mattered enough to gather people in its shade. And the queens, they're still here. Not in monuments or museums, but in the way women bargain, at market-set grain prices, negotiate marriages, in the fact that elder women still settle land disputes in dozens of Sahelian villages, in the way daughters are named after great aunts and grandmothers, trace lineage by voice alone. These are echoes. A fringe story from a remote part of northern Mali tells of a queen who ruled for 40 years and refused to allow her name to be written, not out of modesty, but out of strategy. What is spoken lives, she said. What is written dies under sand. Her people sang her story nightly. When the French arrived with pens and ink, she vanished into wind. You turn now, walking away from the pillar. Behind you, the sun slips beneath the horizon, and the world changes, hue orange giving way to violet light to cool gray. And just before full dark, you hear it not sound exactly, not speech, just a shift in air, a breath maybe, a pause that feels like acknowledgement. The queens are not gone. They are simply waiting for someone to ask, someone to listen, someone to remember not just their victories, but their silences. You walk back toward the last campfire, the last visible structure. But you carry something different now, not knowledge, but a kind of knowing, a sense that not everything has to be seen to be real. And one final thought follows you soft as starlight. Sometimes legacy doesn't need a name, only a listener. The stars are rising now one by one over the wide sweep of the Sahel. The last traces of daylight vanish behind you, and the night presses in, not heavily, but gently, like a worn blanket draped across tired shoulders. You walk without rushing. The world has grown quieter, and so have you. You're entering the last chapter of this journey, a place where echoes give way to memory, where stories settle into the earth. This is where you meet the last queen and the silence after. She ruled near the end, not of a dynasty, not of a kingdom, but of a time when queens still governed with direct voice, when female councils shaped the futures of cities, when matrilineal power passed like breath between generations. Her name was Aminta Diallo, and she stood at the crossroads between sovereignty and disappearance. The colonial forces had arrived, not all at once. At first they came with maps and measurements, then with traders, then with guns. The Sahel had faced invasions before, but this was different. The conquest came with paper, treaties, claims of protection, and most dangerously of all forms, and Aminta knew what that meant. She ruled a trading settlement in what is now southern Mali, a modest court, a firm hand. Her people grew millet-raised livestock, managed salt distribution, and spoke 5 languages across a market that pulsed every third day. Her authority was built on decades of trust. Elders consulted her traders, deferred to her, and when she walked through the crowd, people made space. She saw what was coming long before it arrived. Mainstream records note her only once in a French officer's letter complaining of a native woman who refuses to cede her grain stores for tax without cause. But oral histories tell much more. They speak of her gathering all the council mothers and declaring, "Do not speak to men who bring lines and books. Their lines are cages." They tell of how she continued to host market days, even as French garrisons stationed soldiers nearby. How she fed prisoners in secret. How she delayed annexation by 6 years through clever trade rerouting. You pause by a low stone platform, what remains of her court perhaps. It's modest, flat, not even raised high enough to sit on comfortably. But this is where she made her decisions. Not behind gates, out in the open. A fringe story says she refused to learn French, not out of defiance, but because she believed language was memory, and to learn the colonizers' words would risk forgetting her mother's. She made translators repeat everything twice, not because she didn't understand, but to hear how the meaning changed. Now for a curious detail, Aminta Diallo kept a wooden mask shaped like a jackal's head in her private chamber. It wasn't worn, it wasn't displayed, but when decisions became difficult, she would hold it in her lap during council. No one was allowed to speak while she held it. Only when she placed it down would the room open again. They called it the hour of no lies. Historians still debate whether she formally resisted colonization or simply delayed it through administrative strategy. But resistance doesn't always require banners. Sometimes it looks like giving away grain before tax collectors arrive. Sometimes it looks like hiding girls from census lists to preserve matrilineal lines. Sometimes it looks like silence in the face of a command. When she died, her court collapsed quickly. The French installed a male official who could speak their language. The Widows' Council was disbanded. Market days were standardized. Tribute lists replaced oral traditions. Her name was struck from the official records. Even her grave, if it exists, is unmarked. And yet, you walk now toward the edge of her settlement. Just a clearing with grass pressed low as though people had stood there recently. A ring of old women still gathers here once a year on the anniversary of her death. They don't speak her name aloud. They sit in silence for exactly 1 hour. Then each one whispers a word. Into the wind, truth-grained sky footpath, ancestor refusal stone, and then they leave. No songs, no chants. Just the sound of wind moving through dry stalks. You kneel. The air is still warm from the day, but fading quickly. You close your eyes and imagine her not in glory, not in battle, but sitting quietly on a mat, surrounded by silence, holding the jackal mask, waiting for the room to listen. This was her power, She was the last queen of her line, not because she lacked an heir, but because the world that created her role was being dismantled, replaced by ledgers, by fences, by flags. She didn't disappear. She ended with awareness, with dignity, with clarity. And that ending, it was not a failure. It was a final act of choice. You rise slowly. The wind brushes past your face, and as you begin to walk again, you don't feel the weight of sadness. You feel steadiness, a sense of grounding. The queens were not always victorious. They were not always recorded, but they were always real. And now as night deepens and stars layer across the sky in quiet wonder, you carry their stories with you, not as relics, as truths. The walk ends here, but the remembering begins. So now, take a deep breath. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let the muscles in your neck loosen. You've walked far tonight, across deserts, rivers, walls, and time itself. You've knelt beside forgotten stones. You've touched soil that once heard decisions. You've listened not just to names, but to the spaces where names were supposed to be. You didn't rush. You didn't skip. You stayed. And that matters because history isn't always loud. It doesn't always arrive in the form of kings or battles or declarations etched in bronze. Sometimes it whispers through a broken pot, a fragment of song, a carved spoon passed hand to hand. And the women you met tonight, they ruled in that space, between the grand and the gone, between the footnote and the fortress. Let yourself rest in that. Let your breath slow. Let the rhythm of the night surround you, the rustle of wind through dry leaves, the hush of silence between the stars, the echo of footsteps long erased. They are not lost. They are with you now. And you too have become part of their memory. So close your eyes, lay still, and sleep knowing that the dust still remembers.